Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of AoS Close-Ups. This week we're going to take a closer look at the mightiest of Sigmar's heroes and the captains of his storm host, the Lord Celestants. We will take a look at the background, the two different rule sets available to him, and how each version can be utilized on the tabletop. Except for the still unassigned ranks of Lord Commander, and of course Sigmar himself, no one ranks higher than the Lord Celestants. The Lord Celestants are selected from the greatest of mankind's heroes and imbued with a larger measure of divine might than the rest of the Stormcast Eternals. This is because their role requires them not only to be mighty champions of Sigmar, but more importantly, lead the individual storm hosts to victory. Their individual feats of triumphant martial prowess means nothing when compared to the possibility of ultimate victory in the war against chaos that lies upon their shoulders. Celestants walk amongst their men wielding both Runeblade and Warhammer, smiting, parrying, and dodging enemies, his quick whirling movements loosing arcane hammers towards his foe from the Sigmarite warcloak he wears. All the while, his example provokes a fierce intensity in his fellow Eternals, from which spurs these heroes into greater acts of skill and heroism. Other times, a Lord Celestant chooses to plunge into the ranks of the enemy atop a noble Dracoth. Whereas a Lord Celestant is normally concerted and precise in his attacks, when mounted on a Dracoth he becomes a brutal battering ram of savage violence that is nigh unstoppable. Dracoths are powerful and loyal beasts, able to shred apart any foe with its steel-hard claws and immense fangs. They are indigenous to the realm of Azir and thought to be the descendants of the fabled Star Drakes. They are also able to harness celestial energies that they can use to spit lightning into the ranks of its prey. The sight of a Lord Celestant fighting in the thick of it mounted on a Dracoth will strengthen the resolve of all Eternals witness to it. Nothing can waver a storm host led by such a sight. The first version we will explore is the Lord Celestant with Runeblade and Warhammer. Looking at his attacks, we can see for certain that he isn't a crazy killing machine. If we agree to consider the following 5 stats as a baseline for comparison, a 4+ save, a 4+ to hit and a wound, having no rend and doing only 1 damage, then the Celestant definitely exceeds the medium expectations in these areas. Despite having up to 8 attacks on the charge, we shouldn't expect he'll be able to go solo into combat and devastate your opponent's units one by one. At best, he may eventually out-attrition a target halfway through the game, but what is most likely the scenario for soloing into something is that he's just going to get overwhelmed by superior numbers or outclassed by a better threat. So recognizing he isn't a beatstick, we will need to consider his other abilities to see where he will shine the brightest. His ability Sigmarite Warcloak essentially gives the character a ranged attack that can target multiple units at once. The Celestant unleashes D6 attacks that will inflict 1 mortal wound on a 4-up. Mortal wounds are extremely valuable attacks no matter their form, but do not mistake this attack ability as something more than a sporadic chance to sneak in more wounds. It should not be viewed as a central offensive ability that will allow the Celestant to single-handedly take on threats, but instead as an additional support in a combined attack that could help turn the tide of a particular fight, an ability that will tip an attrition into your side's favor. Moving on to his command ability, I think he fully distinguishes himself as the support character that needs to run with paladins and or liberators. Furious Retribution makes all Stormcast Eternal units better if they are within 9 inches of him, giving them a +1 to hit in combat. However, don't forget that this affects units within 9 inches, not just models, so you may have many scenarios where your unit may mostly be outside that 9-inch bubble, but if at least one model from that unit is partially within 9 inches, then the entire unit benefits. Now, if you're not in the market for a support character with some minor offensive power, and instead want to bludgeon your opponent's forces like a crowbar to the face, then the Lord Celestant on Dracoth is probably more up your alley. The Lord Celestant on Dracoth is twice as fast and is slightly more durable with an additional 2 wounds. He still has a base 6 attacks like his previous version, spreading them out between him and the Dracoth, but these attacks count more as they hit and wound much more often, and both have a rend. But more importantly is the damage each of these attacks can inflict. The Tempesto's Hammer does D3 damage, which combined with his ability Inescapable Vengeance means on the charge, the Celestant damage output can range anywhere from 4 to 18 wounds. Even though the higher output is not going to be a regular occurrence, merely inflicting 6 wounds from the Celestant himself is extremely good against unit, monster, or fellow hero. Then looking at the Dracoth, whose baseline damage is just 1, the intolerable damage ability makes this creature's attacks extremely scary, giving any wounds of 6 a d6 damage characteristic. It's a ticking time bomb of explosive power. This version of the Celestant also has a ranged attack that does mortal wounds, but instead of silly little magical hammers being unleashed from a silly little cape, his Dracoth fires lightning from his mouth, which, according to popular wisdom, is much more palatable and serious. Regardless of your sense of immersion though, this attack does inflict D3 mortal wounds on a 4 up to all units within 2 inches of the point. Though this ability can hit multiple units, I think this ability is a pretty good finisher to any retreating or skulking injured heroes, and can serve to finish off any hobbly monsters even. The Celestant therefore becomes not only a wrecking ball, but a pretty effective hunter. Finally, the command ability Lord of the Host basically allows your army to ignore the battle shock phase of the game. The bubble is an outrageous 24 inches, so you'd have to be running some pretty far peripheral units for this to not take effect. It is an extremely strong ability, though I don't think this makes him a no-brainer over the other Celestant. If you consider that the lowest bravery is 6, and that there are probably few times when multiple units of Stormcast Eternal are going to be taking massive casualties, I think, though the ability is powerful, that in retrospect of the games you'll be playing, you'll find few times when having this over an offensive buff would have been a game changer. The two Lord Celestants fulfill different roles, and choosing which one you take will largely revolve around a ton of different factors, none of which are necessarily how they compare to one another. However, the great thing about AoS is that you don't have to choose. You can take both versions of them at the same time, every time, all the time. I think, of course, that clearly the Dracoth version is all about that offense, and the command ability is maybe debatable as a boon. The unmounted version, however, is all about synergy, making your other Eternals better in combat. His trade-off, to be fair though, of course, is that he needs much more support to keep him alive. So I think if you do end up taking both of these Lord Celestants, you should make the unmounted version your general. Not because he's the greatest thing to hit the table, but because he's not really offering you much on the battlefield if you can't use that command ability. On the other hand, the Dracoth, not using his command ability really isn't an issue. He'll make up for it by delivering the carnage. Remember, anything in this game, except for Flame Phoenixes, and maybe some other exceptions, will die if your opponent concentrates enough on it. So too does this apply to that Dracoth. Don't get crazy. Don't bite off more than you're willing to chew. The last thing I'll say about the Lord Celestant that's mounted on the Dracoth is that thanks to his speed, he's able to quickly react to combats. This essentially gives him the ability to run in your backfield and act as a safety, plunging into combats that need that added little punch to help tip in their favor. And with that ends this episode of AoS Close-Ups. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to comment below, and thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week.